Now, the rest of the story. It began as an ancient Greek legend about a sculptor whose beautiful statue came to life. 1912, George Bernard Shaw wrote a play based on that story. 44 years later on Broadway, the play was made to sing, and the world is whistling still the beautiful tunes from My Fair Lady. You remember the plot. Henry Higgins is a phoneticist, expert in the study of speech sounds, challenged to transform a common flower girl into an elegant lady, mainly by erasing her Cockney accent and replacing it with a refined one. The flower girl is, of course, Eliza Doolittle, and her transformation is indeed a success. Anyway, an English import named Julie Andrews created the role of Eliza on Broadway, and when lyricist, learner, and composer Lowe first described the musical to her, Julie's immediate concern was for the original material. What are these Americans going to do to Bernard Shaw's play, she wondered. But as the world now knows, Lerner and Lowe set Shaw to music with the tenderest loving care. In fact, to get the feel for Eliza Doolittle's humble background, they roamed London's Covent Garden for hours and drank in the spirit of the people and eavesdropped in authentic Cockney conversations. Whenever possible, for example, a Cockney speaker would replace a word with his rhyme. Instead of wife, he might say trouble and strife. Likewise, stairs becomes apple and pears. Cockneys are also fond of dropping expletives right into the middle of other words. Remember the song, Wouldn't It Be Loverly? And that wonderful adverb, abso-bloomin'-lutely. And, of course, there's the broad, unmistakable Cockney sound itself, the very soul of Eliza Doolittle. Also the main reason that she's peddling flowers in the street instead of serving customers in a nice warm shop. The Cockney sound is simply too alarming for educated ears, and so it becomes the mission of phoneticist Henry Higgins to break the chains which have bound Eliza to the lower class. Now, you may have heard that Julie Andrews was 18 when she took the role that made her a star, and whereas that was precisely the age Bernard Shaw had intended Eliza to be, it was the first time an 18-year-old had ever played Eliza. So it seemed to a great many that Julie Andrews was indeed born for that role, and critics agreed. She was captivating as the bewildered young gutter snipe from London's East End. And this, it may be, neither they nor you know. On stage, Eliza was laboriously transformed from a flower girl into a fair lady by an expert in the field of phonetics, but off stage, in real life, the same thing was happening to fledgling actress Julie Andrews. In reverse, you see, her own English accent was refined, became impeccable, and consequently she hadn't the slightest idea how to speak with a Cockney accent. So the director employed a phoneticist to teach her, a real professor of phonetics. He was an American. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Each time I think of My Fair Lady, I think of the song lyrics, Wouldn't It Be Loverly? You know, language has always played a part in My Fair Lady. I don't mean the Cockney accent, which is part of the plot, but language behind the scenes. Let me explain. My Fair Lady was based on a play called Pygmalion by Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw. Shaw wrote the play in 1912 specifically for British play actress Mrs. Patrick Campbell as the play's lead, Eliza Doolittle. Shaw based the character of Eliza Doolittle on Kitty Wilson, owner of a sidewalk flower shop stall that was on the corner of Norfolk Street and Strand in London. Norfolk Street was demolished in the 1970s, but the flower stall was located near where this red telephone box now sits. Kitty sold flowers from the stall until September 1958, when her daughter Betty took over. A month later, the City of London decreed that the corner was no longer designated for street trading, and the flower stall, which had stood on the spot for at least 6 decades, closed forever. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to locate a photo of Kitty Wilson, but you can almost picture Eliza Doolittle hawking her flowers on this street. Shaw based the character of Professor Henry Higgins on several different British professors of phonetics, but mostly on the cantankerous Henry Sweet. Henry was known for his bluntness and his strained relationships with his superiors, co-workers, friends, and even his literary publisher, the Oxford University Press. Despite his frank nature, Henry Sweet earned the label the man who taught Europe phonetics. And Rex Harrison certainly played the part well. Some historians contend that Shaw based his play on the real-life story of a professor at Heidelberg University, Jacob Heaney, who fell in love with his Swiss housemaid, Elise Egloff. Jacob purportedly forced her into several years of bourgeois training to transform her into an adequate wife. Wow. The similarities are undeniable. Remember, Shaw wrote Pygmalion with Mrs. Patrick Campbell in mind as the lead role of Eliza Doolittle. Mrs. Patrick Campbell's real name was Beatrice Rose Stella Tanner. Her friends called her Mrs. Pat. Mrs. Pat read the play Pygmalion and was immediately interested in playing the lead. Before the play could begin in London, rumors persisted that Mrs. Pat was suffering from a mild nervous breakdown, but there's more to the story. While Shaw and Mrs. Pat were working out the details for the London production of Pygmalion, Shaw became obsessed, infatuated with Mrs. Pat. Shaw and Mrs. Pat exchanged numerous love letters. Beyond that, we can only speculate at how far the love affair went. For reasons that remain a mystery, Mrs. Pat broke off the relationship. Shaw and Mrs. Pat remained friends and continued working together on a professional level. During this time, Shaw's Viennese literary agent, Siegfried Trebisch, translated Pygmalion into German. The first production of Pygmalion opened on October 16, 1913, at the Hofburg Theater in Vienna, Austria. It's now known as the Burg Theater, which translates to Castle Theater. The Burg Theater is the National Theater of Austria. So the first time anyone experienced what we now know as My Fair Lady was in the German version in 1913. While Shaw and Mrs. Pat were rehearsing Pygmalion for the London stage, the first New York production of the play opened on March 24, 1914, in the German-language Irving Palace Theater. 3 weeks later, on April 11, 1914, Pygmalion finally opened at His Majestic Theatre in London. Several years ago, I saw a production of The Lion King in this theater, and it was an unforgettable experience. The theater is absolutely gorgeous. If you get a chance to see a production, any production at all at this theater, do it. You won't regret it. The play was a huge success. It ran for 118 performances in London. It was translated into several different languages and was performed around the world. In 1938, Pygmalion was adapted for the big screen. It starred Leslie Howard as Professor Henry Higgins and Wendy Hiller as Eliza Doolittle. Like the play, the film was a financial and critical success. It won the Oscar for Best Screenplay and received 3 other nominations. The screenplay for Pygmalion was reworked into the 1956 theatrical musical called My Fair Lady, starring Rex Harrison as Professor Henry Higgins and Julie Andrews as Eliza Doolittle. My Fair Lady, the musical, was a huge success. It won 6 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. It set the record for the longest run of any musical on Broadway up to that time. The London production, also with Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews, was hugely successful as well. Based on the continued success of the musical, Warner Brothers created a film version of the musical. Rex Harrison reprised his role as Professor Henry Higgins, but Warner Brothers wanted a bankable Hollywood star to play Eliza Doolittle. Audrey Hepburn, as you know, got the part. The film was the second highest grossing film of 1964, second only to Mary Poppins starring Julie Andrews. My Fair Lady won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor. The film was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. So the next time you see the film or a photo from My Fair Lady, you'll know that it was a play based on the lives of real people, which became a film, then became a musical, then became a musical feature film, which has been preserved for future generations. You know, I love Audrey Hepburn in this film, but I'm just one of the many who would have liked to have seen Julie Andrews as Eliza Doolittle in the film. But Julie Andrews didn't do too shabby for herself. Do you have a favorite Julie Andrews movie? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and as Paul Harvey would say, good day.